There are some memories that don't feel scary when they happen. They only become terrifying years later, when you finally understand how close you were to never making it home. I've had more than one of those moments in my life. And every single time, the fear came from the same realization. If one tiny detail had been different, I wouldn't be here telling this story. The first time I learned that lesson, I was just a kid. I grew up in Ohio in the 1970s, back when parents didn't worry too much about where you were as long as you came home before dark. My best friend Joe lived next to a massive stretch of woods, real woods, thick, quiet, endless. The kind of place where sound dies fast and help feels very far away. We practically lived out there. Weekends, summers, any chance we got. We played frontiersmen, built shelters, set traps, tried to make fire with sticks, and disappeared into the trees like they were another world. Those woods felt safe to us, familiar, almost friendly. When we got older, that confidence followed us into stupid decisions. In high school, we got obsessed with the movie Stand By Me, so we decided to do our own version. We walk along abandoned railroad tracks deep into the country, fish from forgotten bridges, and camp just far enough from the rails that no one would notice us. It was dangerous, illegal, and honestly reckless. But nothing bad ever happened. Not once. That's what made it feel invincible. We did those trips over and over, hiding from trains at night, making tiny fires, falling asleep to the hum of the rails. Looking back, it feels unreal that we survived it without incident. After high school, life pulled Joe and me in different directions. We both moved away, but we stayed close. And whenever we ended up back in town at the same time, we'd sit outside by a fire, drink, and relive those old stories. One summer in the mid-90s, nostalgia mixed with beer in the worst possible way. We decided to do it again. Just one more trip. One night. Like old times. My wife dropped us off near where we used to start. She told us we were crazy. She wasn't wrong. Joe suggested we walk the tracks in the opposite direction this time, somewhere unfamiliar, just to keep it interesting. We had a map, we knew the area well enough, so I shrugged and agreed. The day itself was perfect. We laughed, talked, smoked a little, sat on a bridge and watched the water below. It felt like being young again. By dusk, we picked a place to camp. The tracks ran through a thick section of forest, trees packed tight on both sides. It felt like a tunnel made of shadows. Before setting up our hammocks, we did what we always used to do. We scoped the area, made sure we weren't accidentally camping on someone's land. We walked about 100 feet into the woods and climbed a small hill. That's when we saw it. At the bottom, maybe 100 yards away, was a building barely visible through the trees. At first we thought it was nothing, a shed, a sugar shack, something forgotten. There was no road leading to it. No lights. No sound. Still, curiosity pulled us closer. As we moved downhill, the shape became clearer. It wasn't a shack. It was a church. An old one, small, sagging. The wooden planks were dark with rot and moss. The cross on top was blackened by time. Every window was empty, no glass, no doors, just open doorways leading into darkness. Inside, we could see rows of pews, a raised platform where a preacher would stand. There were no footprints, no paths, no signs of life. An abandoned church deep in the woods with no way in or out. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both felt it. This place was wrong. We didn't explore, we didn't go inside. We left immediately and went back to our campsite, making sure the hill stayed between us and the church. We told ourselves it was just the natural creepiness of finding a church in the middle of nowhere. As night fell, we climbed into our hammocks. That's when we heard it. At first it was faint, almost easy to ignore. Then Joe whispered, "Do you hear that?" I listened. It sounded like singing. The sound didn't come from one direction. That's what made my stomach tighten. It drifted through the trees, low and slow, like a hymn stretched thin, not loud enough to understand the words, but clear enough to recognize the rhythm. A group of voices, not one, several. I whispered, "Yeah, I hear it." The singing rose and fell, carried by the night air, then faded. For a few seconds, everything went quiet again. No crickets, no wind, just the rails humming faintly in the distance. Joe shifted in his hammock. "That's not coming from the tracks," he said. He was right, trains had a sound, voices didn't. The singing came again, closer this time, still soft, still wrong. It felt like it was circling us, bouncing off the trees, never settling in one place. My mind went back to the church. I didn't want to say it. Neither did Joe. We lay there, staring up at the dark canopy, pretending we were calm. Minutes passed, the singing stopped again. I started to convince myself we'd imagined it. Then a voice spoke. Not singing. Talking. It came from downhill, from the direction of the church. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't whispering either. It sounded like someone addressing a crowd, calm and steady, like a sermon carried just far enough to be heard. Joe sat up slightly. "Nope," he muttered, "I don't like this." Neither did I. We told ourselves it had to be kids, maybe college students messing around, maybe a weird local group using the church for something harmless. But none of those explanations made sense. There was no road, no trail, no cars, and no reason anyone should be out there at night. The voice stopped. Then footsteps began. Not running. Walking. Multiple sets. Crunching leaves, snapping twigs, slow, deliberate. They were coming uphill. Toward us. Joe swung his legs out of the hammock. "We're leaving," he whispered. I didn't argue. We moved fast but quietly, grabbing only what we could carry. No lights, no talking, just controlled panic. The footsteps kept coming. We could hear breathing now, low murmurs, someone laughed softly. We stayed low and moved through the trees, putting as much distance between us and the hill as possible. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound made my heart spike. Finally, the woods opened up and the railroad tracks came into view. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. We climbed down the embankment and started walking fast along the rails, not caring anymore if we were seen. We just wanted out. That's when we heard the singing again. This time it was behind us. Closer than before. Joe broke into a jog. I followed. The sound didn't chase us, but it didn't stop either. It just continued, calm, confident, like it knew exactly where we were going. After what felt like forever, the singing faded. The forest thinned. We finally reached a road. We didn't slow down until my wife's headlights cut through the dark. She knew something was wrong the second she saw our faces. We didn't explain much on the drive home, just enough to make her lock the doors and keep driving. Years passed. Joe and I never went back. We never talked about it much either. It became one of those stories you avoid thinking about too deeply. Then about 10 years ago, I read an article online. It mentioned a group that had been operating quietly in rural areas across multiple states in the 80s and 90s. They targeted isolated places, abandoned buildings, churches. They held nighttime gatherings. They sang. They preached. And when outsiders wandered too close, they followed. Not to scare them. To decide what to do with them. The article mentioned several disappearances near railroad tracks. Unsolved. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. Because for the first time, I understood something I'd never considered before. They didn't chase us that night. They let us leave. And sometimes that's worse. After I read that article, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went looking for more. At first, it was just curiosity, a way to convince myself that what Joe and I experienced had a reasonable explanation, something documented, something distant. But the deeper I searched, the worse it got. There were forums, old message boards, archived posts from the early days of the internet, people telling stories that felt uncomfortably familiar. Abandoned churches in the woods. Nighttime singing. Groups that appeared silently and vanished just as easily. Different states, different years. Same details. One post stopped me cold. A man wrote about hiking with two friends in the late 80s. They found a small church miles from the nearest road. That night, they heard hymns drifting through the trees, footsteps approaching their camp. They ran. Only two of them made it back. The third panicked, tripped, and separated from the group. They searched for him for days. The only thing ever found was his backpack near the tracks. Another story came from a woman who grew up near a rural rail line. She remembered her father warning her never to follow the singing if she heard it at night. She thought he was joking. He was. He'd been part of a search party years earlier. They found an abandoned church filled with candles, benches arranged in a circle, and handwritten notes pinned to the walls. Names. Dates. Some crossed out. I started to feel sick. These weren't ghost stories, they weren't urban legends passed around for fun, they were fragments, pieces of something real scattered across decades. What scared me most was how consistent everything was. The singing was always calm. The voices never shouted. No one ever ran. Because they didn't need to. They waited. Joe called me a week later. I hadn't told him about the article or the posts. I hadn't even mentioned that night in years. He said he'd had a dream. He was back in the woods, standing near the church. This time the doors were open. Inside, the pews were full. Every person had their head turned toward him. Smiling. They knew my name, he said quietly over the phone. In the dream, they kept saying it. Neither of us laughed, neither of us brushed it off. We changed the subject and never brought it up again. But after that, I started noticing something else. Every now and then late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear it. Not outside. Not in the distance. In my head. A melody I couldn't place, familiar but just out of reach, like a song you know from childhood but can't remember the words to. I'd wake up with my heart racing, convinced someone had been standing at the foot of my bed. Nothing was ever there. Months passed, then years. The sound stopped. I thought maybe it was over. Until last fall. I was driving home late from work, taking a back road to avoid traffic. As I passed a stretch of trees near an old rail line, I saw something that made my hands tighten on the wheel. A small wooden sign half hidden by weeds. It had been nailed to a tree. Black paint, simple letters. Sunday service. All are welcome. There was no arrow. No address. Just the woods behind it. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. But in my rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement between the trees. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't gone. They never were. I didn't tell anyone about the sign. Not my wife. Not Joe. Not even myself, really. I tried to pretend it was nothing, some local church group, a prank, a coincidence that only felt meaningful because of what I already knew. But coincidences don't stay quiet. A few weeks later, Joe called again. His voice sounded tight, like he'd been holding something in for too long. You ever feel like you almost remember something? He asked. I knew exactly what he meant. He told me he'd been waking up at the same time every night, always just before dawn, always with the same sound in his head. Singing. Not loud. Not threatening. Patient. Like something waiting. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. I think they recognized us that night, he said, not as strangers, as people who almost stayed. That idea lodged itself deep in my mind. Because when I thought back to the woods, to the way the footsteps moved uphill, to how calm the voices were, something became painfully clear. They weren't hunting. They were evaluating. Seeing how we reacted. How we moved. How quickly we broke. And when we ran, they didn't need to follow. They already knew where the tracks led. I went back to the forums one last time. Most of the posts were gone now, deleted accounts, dead links, but one thread remained untouched for years. The final comment was short. If you hear the singing and escape, don't go back. They don't forget faces. And they don't need a building to gather. That's when it hit me. The church was never the point. It was just a place to meet. I don't take back roads anymore. I avoid rail lines. I don't camp. I don't even like driving through heavy woods at night. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the world feels too still, I swear I can hear it again. Not outside. Not far away. Closer. Like a memory gently reminding me how lucky I was. Because some people hear the singing once. Others hear it every Sunday. If this story made you feel uneasy, good. That means you're paying attention. There are hundreds of stories like this buried online, half-deleted, dismissed, or forgotten. And every week, more people stumble into places they were never meant to find. So before you scroll away, subscribe. Not for jump scares. Not for cheap horror. But for the stories that feel too real to ignore. And if you've ever heard something you couldn't explain, something that followed you long after it stopped, leave a comment. Sometimes the only way to stay safe is to know you're not the only one listening.